The Neoplatonism of Dean Inge by R. Baine Harris. William Ralph Inge, 1860 to 1954, is already known by most Neoplatonic scholars through his monumental study, The Philosophy of Plotinus. His public career extended for more than 60 years, and he was one of the best-known Englishmen of his day. Trained primarily as a classicist, he became interested in philosophy in his mid-30s, finally settling in his mid-forties upon the thought of Plotinus, and remaining a serious student of Neoplatonism for the rest of his life. In addition to his work on Plotinus, he is the author of more than 45 major books and an equal number of pamphlets and scholarly articles. His first major book was published in 1899, and his last article was published in 1954, when he was 94. In his books, he sets forth a form of Christian Platonism that is roughly in the same tradition as Augustine, Erigena, Eckhart, and the Cambridge Platonists, and especially the latter. His Neoplatonism is to be found mainly in his ontology and epistemology, although there are distinctive Neoplatonic sub-themes running throughout his theology, psychology, and ethics. In contrast to Erigena, he should be regarded as Neoplatonic Christian rather than a Christian Neoplatonist, since he returns to distinctively Christian commitments in the final stages of his theory of salvation, his theology, and his ethics. Contrary to Erigena, he does not attempt to provide a Christian religious meaning within a metaphysical framework that is Neoplatonic in its architectonic structure, but forms his own idealistic synthesis without an appeal to a Neoplatonic logic or dialectics. Inge saw one of the main intellectual difficulties of Christianity in the modern age to stem from the attempt to present it purely as a religion and, more specifically, the effort to present it apart from its inherent Neoplatonic ontological element. Without a metaphysics, he believed it will not be able to compete with its rivals. In the last chapter of his major book on Plotinus, he writes, "Our task is very much the same as that which was laid on Plotinus and his successors in their day. They also had a precious tradition to preserve, and as happens so often in human life, they won their victory through apparent defeat. They resisted Christianity and were beaten, but the Church carried off so much of their honey to its own hive that Porphyry himself would have been half satisfied if he had seen the event. For us, the whole heritage of the past is at stake together. We cannot preserve Platonism without Christianity, nor Christianity without Platonism, nor civilization without both." Ontology. In his own ontology, Inge distinguishes between essence and existence, but treats the distinction as polarity. Reality is a higher existence, and existence is a lower reality. He does not postulate two worlds, one of substance and one of shadow, nor set an unreal natural order in opposition to a real supernatural one. The visible world is no deceiving phantom. It is the creation and copy of a higher sphere of existence, but the two are numerically one. Reality is constituted by the laws that make up the content of the mind of God. These laws are to be identified with the eternal values and are to be regarded as existence as well as ideals, for they are powers as well as creative values. He regarded truth, goodness, and beauty to be the most real elements in our world of experience, and he viewed them as extensions of the deity. As such, they are literally the most real things in the world. He writes, "Things truly are in proportion as they participate in goodness, truth, and beauty. These attributes of reality, which so far as they can be known, constitute its entire essence. That is, today they belong to a sphere of supratemporal and supraspatial existence, which obeys laws of its own, and of which the world of common experience is a pale copy. Value and reality are ultimately identical. To be is to have value, and the eternal values have objective existence. Our world of existence, our world of process and becoming, is built up out of our own valuations of existence." Inge comments, "Existence is itself a value, and an ingredient in every valuation. That which has no existence has no value. It is quite certain that we can think of no existing world without valuation. The ultimate identity of existence and value is the venture of faith to which mysticism and speculative idealism are committed. It is indeed the presupposition of all philosophy and religion. The world does not have its own independent objective existence. We contribute something to its existence in the act of knowing it. Valuation is necessary for existence to have meaning, and the valuation of existence leads to the production of a scale of values." He concludes that there could be no greater error than to leave the two judgments, that of existence and that of value, contrasted with each other or treated as unrelated to our experiences, and he frankly admits that the identification of existence and value on their various levels can only be asserted as an act of faith. Epistemology. In his own epistemology, Inge asserts that there are levels of knowledge and knowing. The sort of knowledge gained through the senses is adequate for some levels of understanding, but not for the highest mental judgments, such as the understanding of human personality, for example. Knowledge gained through logical and psychological operations may be adequate for scientific purposes, but not for metaphysical judgments. The level of knowing must correspond to the level of being of the object involved, and knowledge of the supreme principle is different in type from all other types of knowledge. Faith. All forms of knowing, including scientific knowledge, must begin with some element of faith, since all values must begin with an act of faith. Faith differs from existential knowledge in that it entails the recognition of an objective, external, and ideal standard of value by which things given in experience may be judged. Inge further asserted that knowing and valuing are inseparable. Knowledge cannot occur apart from some form of evaluation, and all affirmations of knowledge have some valuations implicit in them. Essentially, he claims that the level of knowledge is dependent upon the manner of evaluation. Valuation is not the direct product of either the will or the intellect, but is a primitive experience arising normally in our response to the ideal as we encounter it in human experience. It is neither an intuition nor a pure feeling. Knowledge. The first level of knowing is the level of faith. The second level, the level that is usually called knowledge, is the level of relational knowledge, and it is here that both science and metaphysics are produced. This stage is not in opposition to the primitive faith state, but it exhibits a higher level or organization. It is subdivided into two operational levels. 1. The development of the discursive intellect, and 2. The development of reason. The first aims at the achieving of a logical synthesis, and the second aims at the total synthesis of the whole of human experience. The highest function of the higher reason is the production of a metaphysics in which judgments of fact and judgments of value are fully reconciled. In order for science to be converted into metaphysics, the higher reason, or nous, the total knowing of the whole person, must be engaged to exercise judgments that could not be made within the limits of logic alone. Facts are not reduced to values, and values are not reduced to facts, but both are highly integrated in producing many valued, i.e. metaphysical judgments. The third and highest level of knowing is the level of love. Relational knowledge, at its best, cannot provide the sort of complete knowledge for which the human spirit longs, but complete knowledge is possible through love. Such knowledge is not complete in the sense of being an adequate human experience. It can come only as the product of considerable personal intellectual discipline and spiritual growth. Although this form of super-relational knowledge is the very highest form of faith and knowledge, it cannot be adequately characterized as a form of either one of them. Although no exact line of demarcation can be drawn between relational and super-relational knowledge, the latter state may be said to occur when the mind in love rises above the level of nous, so that nous passes into a higher level of synthesis than a synthesis of facts and values. At this point, there is a complete harmony of feeling, intellect, and will, and thus the complete unification of the personality. Inge does not believe that knowing at the level of love resolves the various intellectual difficulties that existed on a lower level of knowing. It does not provide solutions to logical antinomies, and it does not eliminate the laws of logic. Neither does it make metaphysics unnecessary. It transcends but does not dissolve the various logical and metaphysical issues involved in relational knowledge. It does not annul the distinction between knowing and being, and between thought and its objects. In perfect knowledge, there is perfect correspondence of thought and object, but this is not the same as ontological identity. This super-relational level of knowing, however, is the basis of religious knowledge. More divine mysteries can be revealed through love than through active work or metaphysical judgments. Theology. Inge is essentially Augustinian in his theology. He accepted the distinction between the God of religion and the God of philosophy and concluded that Christianity has never been deficient in its conception of the former, whereas it has been in the latter at various times, including the present age. He believed that Christianity was able to exist without a well-defined philosophical theology for its first 3 centuries, but was provided with one only through the aid of the Middle Platonists and Plotinus. Essentially, what Plotinus contributed to Christianity through Augustine and others was the notion of a truly transcendent absolute. Thus, Inge saw Christianity's chief contemporary theological deficiency to be the product of various modern attempts to depart from the basic Platonic, Neoplatonic conception of God that has been a part of Christian philosophy since Augustine. God as the absolute. Although Inge does not hold to the idea of God's absolute immutability, as is suggested by both Plotinus and Augustine, he rejected the Hegelian absolute and all forms of theism that allow a fundamental change in the character or essence of the deity. For Inge, God is absolute in the sense of being self-sufficient. He exists both in and apart from the created order, and he is not dependent upon it for his essential attributes or for his continued existence. He is, however, affected by the universe to some extent, and is capable of being moved by events that occur within it, including the decisions of men, even though his nature is not severely altered nor his purposes frustrated by these decisions. Late in his career, he decided to abandon his early use of the word absolute in reference to the deity, God and the world. According to Inge, the relation between God and the physical universe is transitive, asymmetrical, and irreflexive. God is essential to the existence of the world, but the world is not essential to God's nature or existence. It is but the expression of his mind and the field in which his thoughts and purposes are actualized. Anything we learn about the natural universe teaches us something about the nature of God, since the two are not separate entities. God is immanent in the world, but the world is not immanent in him. God in the world. Inge clearly says that Platonism alone, including Neoplatonism, cannot provide an adequate conception of God and needs to be supplemented by the Christian doctrines of the Incarnation and the Cross, both of which are compatible with it, although not inherent in it. The doctrine of the Incarnation provides an added dimension to the idea of God not foreseen by the Platonists, for not only is God immanent in all instances of beauty, truth, and goodness, he is also immanent in flesh, in historical humanity, and in tragedy and suffering. The full doctrine of Jesus Christ as the Logos, Inge believes, bridges the gap between an unchanging God and a changing world, and simultaneously allows for both divine transcendence and divine immanence. In Jesus Christ, the Platonic ideals of wisdom, goodness, or perfection, and beauty are converted into the simple assertion that God is love. Without the doctrine of the cross, namely the thesis that divine goodness necessarily leads to divine self-sacrifice, there is no Christianity. The nature of man. Like Ficino, Inge returned to the ancients for his basic inspiration, minimized asceticism as an ideal, affirmed man as a legitimate part of nature, upgraded freedom of choice, and affirmed the essential identity of philosophy and religion. In fact, one of his main theses, that early Christian philosophy put the capstone in the arch of Greek philosophy, had already been stated in almost identical form by Ficino. As a Christian theist under the strong influence of Plotinus, he could not regard man as the measure of all things, nor as the crown of creation. Yet he does take the dignity of man quite seriously. Like Plotinus, he insists that it is the conception of man as a soul that allows a metaphysical ground for establishing his inherent worth, for unless man can be viewed as having some transcendental element that is valued by something more than man, he may only be prized as a tool for the working of human ends. Like Plotinus, he establishes the worth of man in his inherent literal identity with God through the spark of divinity that he believed to constitute an essential part of human personality. Man as body. According to Inge, man is simultaneously body, soul, and spirit, and cannot be adequately defined on an exclusive material, psychical, or spiritual basis. All of his three natures are operative in every situation in which he finds himself in the present world order. Man is a living mirror of the universe. He recognized that there is an element in human nature that mitigates against the development of man's highest potential. His position is that the body as the body is not necessarily evil, even though there are elements within the body that work against the development of the soul. Following St. Paul, he characterized this as the flesh at war with the spirit, but he also teaches that the body itself can be reformed as a spiritual body. Following Plotinus, he regards that which is natural as basically an extension of the soul and hence potentially redeemable, even on its lowest levels. Just as the soul is reformed and refined through its conformity to the spirit, so the body is improved by the working of the spirit through the soul upon it. Man as soul. In the strictest sense, Inge did not believe in the existence of a soul as a being, i.e., as a self-existing individual that is transcendent and everlasting. Instead, he regarded it as the function of being alive in space and time and the result of the interplay of feeling, will, and thought. Man's psychical life embraces much more than his empirical self, which is generally stable, but not absolutely stable in man. Although the human soul does not have independent existence, self-determination, and full self-consciousness, it does have an independent value. His position was that the individuality of the soul is a fact of experience and history, even though it may not necessarily be considered to be an eternal possession. Our soul is not something we own or control or do with as we please. Man is thus only potentially an individual. His individuality is grounded in his being in the image of that which has greater individuality than he does. Although the unity of soul life is not realized in space and time, it is realized in the eternal world. Man as spirit. Inge always uses the word spirit to signify the divine, and when he says that man is spirit, he means only to affirm that man possesses some element of the divine nature. For Inge, spirit is not separate from the soul, but it is not the soul in its normal operation as the empirical self. It is the divine core of the soul, the highest and most real aspect of its being. It is the soul at its best, just as the flesh is the soul at its worst. It is the immanence of the divine in the human heart. Essentially, Inge's view is that man is potentially spirit, but rarely actually spiritual. He is not an eternal spirit, but possesses enough of the divine to be spiritual. He does not possess a spirit any more than he possesses a soul. His spiritual essence, which is his true essence, is hidden in the normal operation of the empirical self. Man as a person. The essence of Inge's Neoplatonic Christianity is to be found in his doctrine of man as a person. In contrast with the personal idealists, he held that man cannot be defined as a self-conscious ego, that is, as an individual, or as a person existing on his own and within his own powers. Inge held that man is a person, but he is only what he is to God. He is that particular individuality that he has in the mind of God. His worth is his worth to God, and his personhood consists in the particular role that he plays in the life of God. This explains why he cannot be said to be a body, a soul, or a spirit, even though he has bodily, psychical, and spiritual natures. It further explains why it is not easy for him to know his own true personality. This idea of personhood, Inge believes, is the basis of the Christian teaching of the dignity of man. Man's worth cannot be located in his being a biological organism or a psychical or spiritual monad, and it is not to be found in his worth to society or to the state, or even to himself. It is to be found only in his worth to God, a theme that raises the level of his dignity beyond that to be found in various utilitarian social philosophies. The practical result of such a view is that it guarantees the notion of man as an end. Inge further makes a distinction between man as a personality and man as a person. The former may be described and defined as a process, but the latter is an ideal and is only rarely grasped. It is an aim of religion to assist man in adjusting his personality in accordance with his true personhood, to adapt his physical and psychical behavior into conformity with his spiritual nature. This is the only way man can realize his own true self as a person. Human salvation. Man's salvation, according to Inge, is still much more than the refinement of his body and soul in terms of his spirit. Although he follows Plotinus in his journey for self-improvement through ethical self-culture, the elimination of the power of the passions and the control of the will, the final stage of salvation is somewhat different from that suggested by Plotinus. Instead of the return of the alone to the alone or the reduction of the non-divine elements, Inge suggests rather the higher integration of the divine elements with the human. Salvation for Inge is Emmanuel, God with us, a union that does not dissolve the distinction between the individuality of the divine and the human, but instead intensifies the individuality of the human in the presence of the divine. The individual character of the divine is preserved as divine, and the individual character of the human is preserved as human. Inge writes, "Our inner life should be a progressive transformation of soul into spirit. Spirit is the divine part of our nature, potentially but not actually ourselves. We do not believe in the absorption of personality in an impersonal absolute. The I and thou relationship remains to the end. Otherwise, love and worship would cease." Religion, for Inge, is that attitude and activity that leads man to come to realize his own full personality. It is whatever assists man in finding his own conscious existence in God. This unification of the personality cannot be achieved through the integration of self-consciousness within the limits of the empirical self. It can only be achieved on a religious basis, namely, through the identification of the individuality of the self with the universal life. Inge writes, "To attempt to find self, the individual, without God, the universal, says Professor Ritchie, is to find the devil. The individual assumed by the psychologist and by the common political and ethical theories is a halfway abstraction of the ordinary understanding, a bastard product of bad metaphysics and bad science. Christianity, from the very first, rejected it. This paradox of the spiritual life implies that the universal and individual are abstractions, each of which would collapse without the other. Indeed, the union of individuality and universality in a single manifestation forms the cardinal point in personality. Although religion involves the loss of the ego, it does not lead to the complete loss of selfhood. Quite the contrary, it leads to the discovery of oneself, that is, to the discovery of the true nature of one's own individuality in terms of the role one plays in the universal life. Finally, Inge's humanism is to be seen in his belief in the essential unity of philosophy and religion. From a distant perspective, his whole career may be seen as an effort to bring these two ancient disciplines closer together in the modern period. This he proposed to do by giving philosophy a considerably broader role than that allowed to it by most philosophers of his day, returning to the ancient conception of it as an ars vivendi, in which all forms of knowledge, scientific, religious, and otherwise, would be synthesized. His dialectic is nearer to Plato's than to the dialectic of Plotinus, but he agreed with Plotinus that the final vision of truth occurs beyond the limits of the dialectic. To say the least, Inge believed that in their final phases, philosophy and religion are identical. In his book on the philosophy of religion, God and the Astronomers, he expressed his conviction that it is possible to work out a harmony among science, philosophy, and religion if science is kept within its limits and not allowed to expand into metaphysics, and if philosophy and religion do not take on the character of a science. Dr. Rudolf Metz, in his 100 Years of British Philosophy, written in 1938, gave the following assessment of Inge's contribution. The real import of his work is in his having focused the intellectual life of England upon historical forces and powers which had hitherto been in part buried and hidden. Present-day English philosophy owes him a noteworthy widening of its cultural horizon, the sharpening of its vision for far views over space and time, a training in genuine thought about and insight into history and the philosophy of civilization. Inge seems to me to feel more vividly than any other contemporary British thinker that philosophy is not a self-sufficient detached affair, but an organic member of the general culture of the mind, in which it is included and which is operative in it. Inge found no school of thought, and there is little evidence that he has any remaining major philosophical disciples. He once said that the nation that first finds a practical reconciliation between science and idealism is likely to take the front place among the peoples of the world. His pioneering efforts in pointing out the formula for this reconciliation are still worthy of our consideration.